Hi, this is Frankie, and in this video we're going to take a look at React. This is actually going to be a multi-part series where we work on building a really awesome Pokedex. So to start off, we have some basic CSV data from the Pokedex that I found online, and we're just parsing that into a usable format where we have numeric IDs and the names of the Pokemon. So now we're going to actually get started on displaying this with React. So I'm going to get rid of everything. And the first thing you'll notice is this line up here, which says that we are going to be using something called JSX, and by default, our elements will be on react.dom. So this gives us a lot of the basic elements like divs and spans and paragraphs and unordered lists and stuff like that that we need. Now, what actually is going to happen is this is going to go through a parser that turns our JSX syntax into just plain JavaScript that the browser can run. JSX is optional, but it's really, really useful, so we're going to use it. So the first thing we need to do is set up React to start rendering things to the document. So we do this by doing react.render component, and it takes two arguments. The first one is the component to render. So for now, I'm just going to have a span that says hello world, and the second argument is going to be the element to render it into. So I'm just going to render it into a div called app. And if you look, you can see that it's now working. So you might be looking at this and saying, hey, that's not JavaScript. And it's not, it's JSX, which is just a really easy way to describe our views using an XML-like syntax inside our JavaScript. And this probably sounds like a really bad idea to you based on everything you've been told, but it's not. You're just going to have to trust me on it, and you'll understand when you start using it. So now this is great, but we don't want to just put a ton of stuff in this render component call. We want to separate it into reusable modules or just isolated modules that have one job. So to do this, we're going to create what React calls a class. And there's a few different types of these. The basic one is made with react.createClass. And it takes some options, which are the methods on the class. Some of these are special methods, and then you can, of course, define your own for the component. So the one that's required is called render. It takes no arguments, and it returns these things called virtual DOM nodes. So an example of the virtual DOM nodes would be this span node here. So we can just say return this. And then we'll want to store this somewhere. So we're going to say var Pokedex. And then down here we can Pokedex. And then just using XML, that's a self-closing tag. And you see it does the same thing. So what happens is we render the component. It calls this render function here to get the nodes, and then it renders them to the document. So we want to make this a little more complicated now. We want to pass in this Pokedex data here into our component so that it can use it. So we do this like you might expect, where we create a parameter or an attribute, and we're just going to say data equals, and then with JSX we use curly brackets to say we're putting some JavaScript in there. You could also just have a string like you would normally have in HTML, but we're going to be passing in Pokedex. And then to access these properties inside our element, we can use the same syntax for JavaScript and say this.props.data. And it's going to try to render that list, but we're just going to say .length. So it's going to now show the length of our data. But we don't want that. What we actually want to do right now is just show, let's say, an ordered list of these Pokemon. So we can do this in a few ways. We can do everything right in this view here, or we can create a separate component. So now the alternative way to create a component is to just use a function. So if I come up here and say function Pokemon, and then it's going to take some props and maybe children, and then it returns some nodes. So we're just going to return props dot name for now. And then here we could say we want to create a Pokemon with a name of data 0.name, I believe it was. And then we just make this a self-closing tag. And if that was working, it would show us the correct thing, but let's see what's going on in our console. We're not returning an element. So we're just going to wrap that in span for a moment. Okay. And then we also need to wrap this in this. And we get identifier because the first column is, or the first row is the headers. But then you can see now we get Bulbasaur, and we can change that to different ones, and we get different Pokemon. But what we actually want to do is represent an ordered list. So our Pokemon is going to be a list item. And it just returns that. But what we want to do is have an ordered list, so I'm going to cut this out for a moment, OL, and inside our ordered list, we want to have all of our Pokemon rendered. So in other languages, you have weird things like for each and stuff like that in templating languages. But what we have here is just JavaScript. So we know that we have our props.data, and each of those is going to have a name property. So we can just say this.props.data.map, where we're just using the regular JavaScript map function. And then that's going to take a Pokemon description. And map returns a new item, so we're going to return Pokemon with Pokemon.name. And now, as you can see here, what we're doing is we're mapping this data to our function that just returns a Pokemon for that name. And we have all of this lovely list of Pokemon here. And in the next videos, we're going to go into making things interactive and adding more details and linking things together and all sorts of awesome things that you need in most user interfaces. And we get to do it with Pokemon. So I will see you in the next video.